Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our last flip of your summer assignments, right? Your last and probably shortest flip, right? More than likely, unless it takes me 30 minutes to get through 4 slides, which would be egregious. But anyway, biggest thing about it is that we are now wrapping up your summer assignment content, right? So today's flip is probably the most important one, even though ironically enough, it's the shortest one, right? So the thing about it that we need to understand, though, is that all that stuff that we talked about in those last 3 flips is giving you a heck of a lot of great context, not only for this first unit, but for the rest of the course, probably all the way up until Christmas, right? A lot of that has to do with like the rise of the Habsburgs, the rise of the Renaissance, what makes the Renaissance different from the Middle Ages, things about the Middle Ages that are going to endure all the way up until the 1800s, like feudalism and things like that, right? Also discussing how monarchs were weak and then they were going to grow in power, and that's going to give you a lot of context for the era of absolutism in the 1600s and 1700s, right? So as you can see, those first 3 flips are wildly important for the long haul. This one is much more important for the short end of things, right? Because it's going to help you a lot on your LEQ, and it's also going to help you a lot when it comes to answering the questions that I'm going to be posting to Google Classroom. And it's just 10 of them. They're just practice. You're going to get a Google form that you're going to use like an answer sheet, and then you're going to get a PDF that you're going to use to answer the questions, right? Now, it's not going to be graded for accuracy. It's going to be graded for attempt, and it's just to mainly show you what a multiple choice question according to the College Board looks like. They usually have a supplement that goes along with them, right? Or a text supplement, okay? And what that means is like an excerpt or a picture or something that will actually help aid you in your answer or possibly try to trip you up a little bit, all right? But the big thing about it, though, is that we love AP European history, even though the College Board is the devil, all right? It's like, now, like, the biggest thing, we'll get to more of that here in a few minutes, but what we left off on in our last flip is we were talking about the rise of Renaissance humanism, right? We were talking about how Renaissance humanism is going to serve as, like, the big difference maker between the Middle Ages period going into what we're going to refer to as the Renaissance, right? And humanism is going to be the thing, right? It is the moment in time where everything begins to change. And the idea, the radical idea that was humanism is like lighting a candle in a dark room, right? It's the idea that literally the Middle Ages, which had a period of like low economic output and not as much intellectual like high points as the Renaissance, the 14, 15, 16, 1700s is going to have, in the same amount of like speed, right? The Renaissance, though, adopting humanism and adopting these new perspectives on the world is going to lead to a candle being lit that's going to light that room, right? And then that idea will then spread and light another one and spread and light another one to the point that we're illuminating much more of our understanding of the world and the era that these people are beginning to live in. Now, the big thing about it, though, also to kind of hold on to this in the back of your mind, is that the Renaissance affected the wealthy, right? It affected the wealthy, the upper crust, and the higher ends of society, right? The Medicis were affected by the Renaissance. The Habsburgs were affected by the Renaissance. The Sforzas were affected by the Renaissance, right? All these people are going to be affected by the Renaissance. Your regular everyday Joe Schmo that's like, you know, a serf or like still living under the feudal system, yeah, the Renaissance didn't affect him at all, all right? So just keep that in the back of your mind, all right? Big thing about it, though, is we also talked about the School of Athens serving as a great example of the Renaissance and why Renaissance art is a great example of Renaissance humanism, right? That retelling of Greek and Roman things, right? The reawakening, the rebirth of Greek and Roman themes that are going to be coming back, bringing a rise to the values of antiquity, right? Now, the thing about it that we need to understand, though, is why is the School of Athens demonstrating such a big shift, right? Well, we have to delve back into the Middle Ages for about 2 seconds and understand what was the Middle Ages in the medieval view of antiquity. Well, the thing about it, though, is that they really just didn't care about it too much at all, right? Because let's use the Colosseum in ancient Rome as an example, right? Ancient Rome and the city-state of Rome, which grew to be the largest empire that the world had ever seen, that stretched all the way from Spain and its western tip all the way over to past Constantinople and its eastern tip, right? All the way over into what is now referred to as the Middle East, right? Going all the way as far north as England, all the way far south as northern Africa, right? Crossing and enveloping the entire Mediterranean. It was headquartered from one city, right? Ancient Rome. And ancient Rome, or Rome, even to this day, if you go there, you can visit some of the old imperial Roman ruins, right? Including the Forum of Rome and this bad boy as well, the Colosseum, right? Now, the Colosseum doesn't look like this, though, anymore, right? That's what the Colosseum looked like when it was at its height. When it was at its peak, it is, of course, superimposed into the modern-day city of Rome, but it could hold thousands of spectators that came to watch gladiatorial combat, magicians, jugglers, a variety of different scenes, but gladiatorial combat was the main thing that they want to see. And many of our modern stadiums are based off the design of this ancient structure, right? This thing built in 100 AD, about 100 years after the birth of Christ, this bad boy is going to be built, right? And so the thing about it, though, is that that's what it looked like when it was originally built. This is what it looks like now. Look at how literally many parts of it are gone, right? This part of it has been added to. By the way, these are some of our Chappelle girls a couple years ago who actually went to Rome with me, which was an absolute blast. We had so much fun in Italy. Absolutely loved it. Designed that whole trip myself. But the big thing about it, though, is we're looking at this thing, okay? Looking at the Colosseum itself. Look at the faded brick marks, right? Look at how literally only these parts were, like, left. What are all these holes that are all over it? Some of you are like, are those bullet holes, Mr. Terry? No, they're not bullet holes, actually. That is where, over time, thieves came in and they stole the iron from inside and bronze rods inside the Colosseum itself. So concrete actually needs structural integrity bars to keep it from falling all to pieces, right? Now, in the modern era, your dad, who's like listening to this flip right now, walking around the back, he knows it as rebar, right? Rebar is a composite iron rod that goes into concrete to keep it from breaking, right? Well, they did the same thing in ancient Rome, except they used bronze and iron rods, right? But like literally, metal thieves would go into the Colosseum at night and just chip away at it and rip the rods out and then go off and sell them, right? And no one ever arrested them. No one ever got mad about it because the Middle Ages individuals didn't really care about antiquity that much, right? They allowed the Colosseum to fall into ruin, right? They allowed the Colosseum to have made pieces of it harvested by people that were called stone thieves that would then sell it to Christians that would build some of the earliest monasteries out of it and some of the earliest churches, right? So as you can see, the Middle Ages did not hold in high regard views of antiquity. They did not look at the Romans and the Greeks as the people of like elite society, right? Of elite learning, of where things were better and architectural like feats were better and art was better and poetry was better, right? They viewed them as pagans, right? Because like the pagans is what they were technically, right? Pagans, and also they viewed them as polytheistic people that were not aware of God and Christ and like their religion, right? And so they actually allowed these different structures to fall into ruin because they were dedicated to gods that were not the Christian Judeo gods, right? And this right here is, of course, another view you can see from the Middle Ages of the Forum of Rome falling all into pieces. This is the real, like the remnants of the Temple of Castor and Pollux that still stand there today, right? You've got remnants of the Temple of Jupiter that would be behind us in this picture and stuff like that. So what you're seeing, though, is that the Middle Ages was not a period of rebirth because the era of antiquity, ancient Rome and Greece, was allowed to fall into ruin, right? Those values, those ideas, those things were allowed to fall into ruin. The barbarians that resettled all these lands, including the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns, the Barbars, the Saxons, the Angles, the Jutes, the everybody, the Franks, right? All those people couldn't read Latin, right? Some of them didn't even have written languages, okay? So they weren't reading the works of Titus and Livy and Polybius, the like ancient Greek historian, you know, reading about like the different like wars, like the Peloponnesian War that broke out between Athens and Sparta. The people of the Middle Ages didn't care. They focused on growing the Christian faith, and they focused on resettling all of Europe away from Roman hands, right? So all these things were allowed to fall all to pieces. But the question, though, is why, right? Why would they allow this? A lot of it, like I said, a lot of it has to relate to Christian values and theology, right? The idea that they literally did not connect with the ancient Roman Greek writings because they believed them to be pagans, right? So the thing about it that we also need to understand, though, is that Christian values and theology, which allowed these things to fall all to pieces, also really took a long time to rebuild an academic livelihood, okay? So Christians and theologians and things like that focused on only reading one specific text, the Bible, right? And they would translate it into they translated it into one language, Latin, right? The Judeo-Christians that lived in Western Europe at this time read one book, and it was the Latin text of the Bible, right? And what monks would do for hours and hours a day is literally translate and copying Latin texts from the Bible, right? Translating and copying the works of Peter and Paul and Matthew and all of those other like apostles and things like that. They didn't focus on the ideas of these like ancients that actually like were like very, very like lived hundreds of years before the birth of Christ, right? They didn't focus on the ideas of Cicero and his diatribes, why he thought Julius Caesar was going to spell the downfall of the Republic. They didn't listen to those things. They just copied all these other texts over and over and over again, which made books, if they were available and not related to Christianity, very expensive, right? I mean, I want you to think about this. because they had to be handmade and handwritten, right? What is this thing going to do, though? It's going to keep books and written material out of the hands of common people, right? And also, it's going to keep it out of the hands of even most wealthy people, because only 4% of the population of Europe following the fall of Rome could read and write, okay? Now, if only 4% can read and write, they're not growing the intellectual value. And the church was the hub of the literate and the intelligence, but the thing is that they're only focusing on growing the Christian faith, right? That's all they're caring about, right? So they allowed these Greek and Roman things to fall into ruin, right? Well, what's going to change, though, is going to literally be just a matter of time, right? Like, so it took time and effort and a lot of research to allow these things to come back, right? The Renaissance is not going to happen all of a sudden. No one's going to flick a white light switch and everybody's going to be like, oh, I'm enlightened, right? Like, that's not going to happen, okay? Instead, what happened is over the process of hundreds of years, okay, you're going to see the church eventually begin to grow. And when it grows, it then needs places for monks and nuns to live and dedicate their life to study and transcription of these books, right, and transcription of these Bibles, okay? And what that's going to lead to is the rise of this concept known as the university system, right? What ends up happening is monasteries that were originally used to train priests and nuns and be places for them to actually transcribe, read Latin texts and things like that, they begin to operate a lot like a guild, right? Like, now, do you all remember we talked about guilds, right? There's craft guilds and merchant guilds, right? That idea of everybody coming together and collectively learning how to do a craft or not a work of art, but a craft or selling things better and setting prices on their product. Well, then universities began to operate a lot like a guild, right? Attracting people who wanted to try and prioritize study, right? And trying to prioritize the ideas of learning. And are there better ways and angles of doing certain things, right? In the high and late Middle Ages, texts are going to begin to be rediscovered and translated, right? What's going to end up happening is you're going to see the growth of these individuals from these periods find a lot of this old Roman text. And they're like, well, I can read Latin because I could translate the Bible. What does Livy have to say about life during ancient Rome? What does Titus have to say about the histories of Roman battles and Roman efforts, right? What do we understand? And they begin to rediscover them and they begin to translate them, right? And they begin to become a very high prioritized commodity. And it leads to the growth of this concept known as humanism, right? Humanism then actually kind of begins to illuminate itself outside of those monasteries, right? And it begins to kind of permeate the ideas of society where other workers that were originally usually involved in the church, a lot of our early humanists were trained as priests, right? They actually, what they end up doing is they study poetry by ancient Romans, right? They study literally diatribes of histories by ancient Romans and Greeks, okay? And humanism comes out of that idea because what humanism is a form of study designed by the Italians that emphasizes the study of ancient culture to understand human nature and potential, right? Because they believe to be wait a minute, what is it about the world around us that is so different from the world described in the Bible, right? And the thing about it is that humanism has a very major emphasis on two particular places. Secularism, which is understanding the world around you, right? Like understanding why are these bricks red, right? Why is the clay that makes these bricks in the city of Bologna, which is the very first university ever founded in Europe in 1066, right? And right now, wait, no, 1088. I think it's 1088. Am I right? Is it 1088? 1066 is the invasion of the Normans. If I'm right about this is nuts. Sorry. University of Bologna, founded 1088. Let's go! All right, yeah, anyway, sorry about that. I just have to always, because, randomly, I just know the year that the University of Bologna was founded. But the big thing about it is, what humanists are going to do is they're going to look at this entire cityscape and be like, why is it all the same color? Where did the colors come from? Where does light come from? Where does that come from? Why are the hills green? What makes grass green? And they're going to start asking a lot of questions that focus on the world around them, rather than asking questions like former monastery monks from the early Middle Ages did of how do we best get into heaven? How do I understand the Word of God? How do I understand the life that leads us into the next phase? How do I understand Christ better, right? Those are non-secular questions, right? Instead, what ends up happening, due to the translation of all these ancient Greek and Roman works, because ancient Greeks and Romans were heavily humanistic, they wanted to figure out those questions that those ancients had, right? Aristotle wanted to know why things fall back to the earth, right? He studied that relentlessly, right? So when you translate his works, you end up trying to pick up where he left off, right? And this is going to affect even priests, all right? There's a very, very famous figure that some of you have probably heard of, St. Thomas Aquinas, right? St. Thomas Aquinas is the founder of scholasticism, and he was a Middle Ages monk, right? And he translated the works of Aristotle to try and figure out, is the soul corporeal or not, right? St. Thomas Aquinas has an entire diatribe called On the Soul, where he tries to figure out, does the soul exist here, like here in this world, or is it someplace else, right? That is a secular question because it's trying to understand not necessarily exactly how is that soul going to get from here to God. He's trying to understand what is it in its essence, right? Exactly, okay? And also, the other big thing that humanism focuses on is individualism, right? And individualism is the simple idea of trying to figure out what a human can do. What are they potential of, right? You're going to see the ideas grow of questioning these really deep inner thoughts of like, what can I achieve? Right? What is the most that I can do? Do I have a ceiling on the things that I can achieve, right? And what this is going to lead to is early universities are going to begin to grow the subjects that they teach, right? And they start to add things beyond theology, because theology, of course, was the first one, right? But then they begin to add rhetoric, right? Grammar. Rhetoric, by the way, is how to write and how to write in a convincing manner, right? Grammar and how to actually write using grammatically correct Roman set guidelines, right? History, philosophy, logic, right? And they begin to study things outside of the normal theologian-based ideas. They also studied medicine, but the medicine was completely wrong, all right? So for a long, long time, it was completely wrong. They translated this one guy named Galen. This is actually a funny little moment where humanism went in the wrong direction, right? Galen was an ancient Greek philosopher that believed that the human body only had 4 fluids in it, right? And he was like, oh, it's got black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, right? And then, like, what ends up happening is if you have too much of one of those things, it's what makes you sick, right? And actually in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, is what led to the concept of bloodletting being a scientific approach to healing people, right? Literally cutting your vein open and bleeding blood out of you. That's how you fix somebody. That's how you keep people from getting an infection. Not washing your tools or your hands. No big deal. So the big thing about it, though, okay, is that's kind of a moment where humanism went a little bit wrong. But at the same time, when you actually study a lot of these ancient Roman and like Greek works, you follow along with people like Democritus, right? And Democritus is a guy that came up with the theory of atoms thousands of years before anybody else did. He said that there were these small unbreakable units that bind together to create the world, right? And we can't see them, but they are literally tiny and indivisible, right? He was wrong about the indivisible part. We can't split one. But you see what I'm talking about? Like, it's a very, very important moment that humanism had some missteps, but overwhelmingly so, it had some great moments, all right, that actually added to the progression of history. And when you combine all of these subjects together, what you end up getting in the modern era, this is more of a modern thing. This is never going to pop up necessarily on an AP test. If it does, you'll still be ready, though, which is the kind of teacher I like to be. The big thing about it, though, is when you combine all those things together, when you study secular questions, when you try to understand the world around you, when you try to actually really, really delve into the ideas of philosophy and history and things like that, that these early Renaissance thinkers really actually bought into, that's known as the humanities, right? Literally, when you get a humanities degree, like I got in college, because my major was history, right? Okay, that is a humanities degree connected to the rise of humanism and the Renaissance, right? So the thing about it, though, that now what we need to understand, though, is who are these people? Who are these early humanists? Who are they? What did they do that made them so special and just so different, right? Well, the first one that we have to talk about, or first thing we have to talk about, is that these early writers drew inspiration from ancient writers like Plato, Aristotle, Livy, Virgil was a big one, right? For those of y'all who have been in Miss Urso's class, the fabulous Miss Urso, you definitely know that you've probably heard of Virgil before. He wrote this thing called the Aeneid, which is like the Trojan War Part 2, right? It's about this guy named Aeneas, like returning home from the Trojan War, and in that story, he ends up going off and founding Rome, which is a very different story from the Romulus and Remus founding of Rome, which are the two twins that were like raised by the wolf, and I'm sure y'all know all that stuff, though. But anyway, now, so Virgil was a really, really important poet from like the Pax Romana period, right? Hold on one second. Hello. But yeah, so these earliest thinkers are actually going to grab onto some of these old works, right? And they're going to use them to inspire them and get them to create works of their own, right? And they're going to pick up where those ancients left off in the rise of humanism during the Renaissance. And the very first humanist that we're going to talk about is a man by the name of Dante Alighieri, right? And Dante is what he's formerly known as. It's kind of a lot like Prince, you know what I mean? Like whenever you listen to Prince and stuff like that, he's just Prince. You don't tell him by his last name. It's like Dante, right? That's what we refer to as Dante, all right? And now enter Mr. Terry's angry little rant, all right? So like Dante, College Board, I hope you're listening to this. I hope you hear this. I hope you're listening through my phone. I hope you know what I'm up to, right? I just want to say that it's very obvious that when College Board, okay, the College Board, the entity in charge of creating the ACTs, the SATs, and all this other curriculum that they try to believe that they get to decide what is worth college credit or not, I hate them so much. The biggest thing about it, though, is that they don't even include Dante, the first humanist that we really need to talk about, in the curriculum for European history at all, right? They decided to just go to the Wikipedia page probably for the Renaissance and then just grab the first person that they saw on there and just like, well, this is where we'll start it, all right? It's like, now, literally, Dante is probably the most important early humanist out of all of them. Not only is he important, but the fact of the matter is that he's actually fun to talk about, all right? You literally came in and took the one fun guy out of the entire thing, right? You literally just went in there and were like, what's something that people would enjoy talking about? And you just cut it out, right? And instead put in a bunch of flashcard people like Petrarch and Ficino, right? For the one random Renaissance historian that's probably listening to this right now, who's going to be like, Petrarch is the father of humanism. Yeah, I get it. He started a trend, all right? Whatever. But like Regina George ends up being the downfall of Mean Girls, all right? So the big thing about it that I just wanted to throw out there is I hope College Board is listening to this, because Dante is the legitimate humanist that you should be talking about more than any other one, to serve as an archetype for humanisms that come after the fact. And just because he was born in the 1300s doesn't mean that he's not a part of the Renaissance. And also, Petrarch was born literally 30 years later, so don't even shut it. All right, so like, now, anyway, sorry about that. I'm done now. Now, Dante, all right, is one of the most important figures, though, that we will talk about during the Renaissance, and I don't care what the College Board says, all right? And the reason why is because of his works, all right? Because he is a Florentine vernacular poet, all right? Now, notice really quickly I have that like word vernacular in yellow in the middle of a bunch of white, and I've got it all in capital letters, and it's also just like standing out, right? You need to know what the word vernacular means, all right? Vernacular is when you write in a commonly spoken language, all right? Now, this is a really big deal, okay? Could Dante have written his earliest work that gave him a lot of fame? It's called the Divine Comedy. We'll get to that in a moment. Could he have written it in Latin? Yeah, would have been very humanistic to write it in Latin, right? Would have been very Renaissance to write it in Latin, all right? But he didn't do that. He wrote it in Italian, right? Now, and by writing it in Italian, which is the normal everyday language that he spoke, he walked around Italy because he's a Florentine, which means he's from Florence, right? Again, the cradle of the Renaissance. So the biggest thing about it is being from Florence, okay, one of our like big three northern Italian states where literally the Renaissance will bloom out of, right? The thing about it though is that he spoke Italian every day, right? He didn't speak Latin. No one spoke Latin, right? Like, so the only people that spoke Latin was the Pope every day, right? So the thing about it though is he wrote a story that was going to be the very first like grand epic piece of fiction that is going to come out ever since the Middle Ages. Some people are like, what about Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales? Shut it. All right, so like now, like the big thing about it though, okay, you have to understand is that his work is going to be massively important because he's writing it in a commonly spoken language, all right? He's writing it in the language that you spoke every day, right? And it also reintroduces ancient themes and story structure that symbolizes and mirrors the story structure of Roman epics, right? So Dante is going to basically bring back grand fiction, right? Like he brings back fiction, right? Which is a huge deal. And the biggest work that he's the most famous for is this one right here, known as the Divine Comedy, right? And the way the story goes in the Divine Comedy, and we'll talk about it more and stuff like that in class, we'll review this a little bit extra, and I'll give you some other little kind of like interesting little nuggets that this thing is about. But the Divine Comedy is one of the coolest stories you've probably ever heard in your entire life, right? For those of you who had Mr. Madrano last year, my guy loves that story, right? He loves the story of Divine Comedy. He wants to get to the point where he can read it in its actual Italian one day, right? The thing about it, though, is the story goes is that it's about Dante writing a fiction about where he is the star character, right? And Dante is taking a trip through the afterlife, right? The way the story goes is it opens up in a foggy forest. He's like, hears his name being called by a woman's voice, and then he realizes, oh my God, that's Beatrice, this woman that he was in love with, right? Who actually died an untimely death before they could ever get married. Fun fact, when he wrote this, he was already married again, which is really funny because can you imagine being that wife reading this, being like, who the hell is this girl? All right, now, but anyway, getting into it though, what ends up happening is he hears this voice calling to him, and he runs up a mountain to try and get closer to this voice that seems to be coming from the heavens, right? And these animals come running down. It was a lion, a leopard, and a wolf come running down the side of the mountain. They're like, "You gotta go this way," and turn him back. And so he's perplexed. He doesn't know what to do. And then who shows up? None other than his fanboy crush, Virgil, right? Virgil, the ancient Roman, shows up and says, "Dante, I will take you to that voice. I will take you to your beloved Beatrice. However, we must go through all the phases of the afterlife." And he takes him on a trip, a sightseeing journey of hell, purgatory, and heaven, right? But the biggest one that everybody loves the most is when he goes to hell, all right? So like now, because literally it's also referred to sometimes as Dante's Inferno, right? It's one of my favorite moments in literature is when they're about to walk through the gates of hell, and inscribed in metal above the archway that will lead them down into the pits of hell, literally it says, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," right? It's basically saying, give up hope, welcome to hell, right? Like, so literally they end up going into hell and seeing people that are being encased in flaming coffins, right? That's Dante right there, and Virgil, his guide that's leading him through this whole thing. And they even go through hell, all 9 circles of it, and they end up even meeting Satan, right? Which in Dante's version of like the afterlife, he is actually the one being punished the most. He's actually frozen in a giant lake up to his chest, and he has 3 faces all over his head that are crying perpetually, and giant bat wings that when he tries to flap out of it, it ends up causing great pain to him because it freezes the ice even harder around his legs, right? Like now, and apparently the lowest circle of hell is reserved for people who betray, who backstab, and who mutiny, right? And so literally the 3 people that are being punished the most along with the devil down there, according to Dante, was Cassius and Brutus, the guys that betrayed Caesar and stabbed him, and Judas, right? Judas Iscariot, the guy that gave up Christ, right? They're actually being eaten by the devil over and over and over again. You can see their legs coming out right there, and he's forced to eat them as his sin, right? Which is wild, all right? But that is a crazy story. He then climbs the mountain of purgatory. He gets all the way to heaven. He meets God at one point, which is like a book with rainbows and clouds and stuff like that. Didn't see that coming. But the thing about it is that is an epic piece of literature that's a lot of fun to talk about, because when you talk about the things that he sees in hell, it's crazy. He sees Alexander the Great drowning in a river of blood at one point. He sees these people getting shot with arrows as they're stranded on a boat. He sees all this other, he sees harpies tearing apart trees that were people, but now they're trees. It's like a whole thing, all right? Like, so now, it's a great story. But the thing about it, though, is the College Board thinks that he's not important to talk about, all right? But he thinks this guy is, all right? The College Board is like, oh, but Petrarch is so important. And I get it. Petrarch is important, okay? Francesco Petrarch is considered the father of the Renaissance. He is considered the guy that is the humanist archetype, right? He's just not as much fun to talk about, all right? As a person who loves history, he's just not, all right? Because the thing about it is, did Petrarch spend years studying and translating Latin? Yes. Did he did he write letters to dead Romans like Livy? Yes. All right. So yeah, did he study these manuscripts and study the ruins of Rome as well, and also even like translate the works of Cicero to better understand literally this man defending the Republic of Rome and trying to prevent it from being taken over by an autocracy? Yes. All right. So yeah, and all those things are very important. It's not as cool as seeing the devil. You know what I mean? So now, anyway, but going into it though, also, his translation of the works of Cicero, Livy, and many other Romans will serve as kind of the base model or the cookie cutter for the rest of the Renaissance, right? He also is going to be the guy that coined the terms Dark Ages and Humanism, right? So he's the guy that came up with calling those words, right? Literally, humanism is called a word because Petrarch defined it, right? That idea of studying human potential. What can you achieve, right? Like one of his most famous writings that Petrarch ever did on his own was called The Ascension of Mount Venus, right? Where he literally climbed a mountain that he said had not been climbed since the times of the ancient Romans. And he did not go up there to get closer to God. He went up there just to see the view, but that the journey itself brought him closer to God at the same time, right? So he's very deep and very coffee shop bongos, if you want to go that way. So the big thing about it though is he also coined the term the Dark Ages, referring to the Middle Ages as a period of low intellect and low output, right? He also created new educational models. Now this is a big deal. This is actually very important that he did, right? He actually created the schools of thought of creating curriculum basically and trying to figure out standardized ways to educate men so that the Renaissance Renaissance era would continue to grow, right? He's going to actually make it so the young men study the works of ancient Latin and Greek authors. They're going to study rhetoric, poetry, grammar, moral philosophy, right? And he actually kind of introduces the theme of making sure everybody is educated a certain way, right? His ideas were then seen as the cookie cutter for the rest of the Renaissance, right? Discover something, translate it, and adapt it to the modern era, right? Or make something of it off your own. That's the reason why Petrarch is important, okay? And he is important. So just remember Francesco Petrarch, but also remember that College Board did a dirty when they took Dante out. That's rude. All right, so yeah, there were other early humanists, though, as well, but these are more minor players, right? These guys are kind of just in the background and stuff like that, and just coming up out of the woodwork, all right? You got Boccaccio, for example, who actually translated a lot of Roman works, and he also famously wrote a play and an adaptation story called the Decameron, right? And the Decameron was set in the 1300s, and it's about 12 people hiding in a castle trying to avoid the effects of the plague, right? And the funniest thing about it is if you go onto Netflix, literally the Decameron was just issued on Netflix. I'm going to watch it before school starts and stuff like that, but it just came out on Netflix, right? Literally, it's called The Decameron, right? And it's all these people trying to survive the plague, right? So his work, written almost 1,000 years ago, right, which is bananas, right, just came out, well, not almost 1,000 years ago, more like 600 years ago. So just came out on Netflix, right? So now, so good job, Boccaccio. I'm proud of you. And then there's another guy named Leonardo Bruni who had a little man crush on Cicero as well, and he translated the works of Cicero and became basically like the guy that became the first Renaissance historian, right? Like he took the ideas of Petrarch and then applied it directly to history, right? For example, he linked the decline of Rome up to its fall all the way to when Cicero died, right? He basically said, oh, Latin and its values and works began to kind of all fall to pieces whenever Cicero had died, right? So going into it as well, though, he is a prolific translator of Greek and Roman, and he's the first modern historian, and he was the very first person to divide history into the ancient, the medieval, and the modern, right? He's that guy that gave us that timeline, right? Leonardo Bruni was like, oh, it goes this, right? And that's, we say thank you to Leonardo Bruni for that, right? You also have Marsilio Ficino. You know what, though? We're going to stop there, all right? So, yeah, we're going to stop there because you now know what humanism is about, right? And we'll talk about these other little players as well the further on we go, because we've got to talk about this guy named Lorenzo Valla in a little bit, Marsilio Ficino, and Leonardo Battista Alberti, right? Who was a huge sexist and thought that women didn't deserve to go to school, which is kind of screwed up when you're talking about famous people in time, right? So now, but the big thing about it, though, is as you can see, is there's a couple of little guys that'll pop up, and we'll talk about those little guys, and we'll also begin to talk about civic humanism and Christian humanism when we get to our first days in class, all right? Make sure you bring a notebook, make sure you bring whatever notes you've already been taking, right? And make sure you go ahead and try those practice questions, all right? Give it a shot, write that LEQ. If y'all need any help, let me know. So shoot me an email, and I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.